This, the first lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, introduces some of the major contributors to the development of political economy, which for several centuries served as the arena of debate over what type of socio-political arrangements and institutions best serve the needs of people. Thoughtful individuals work to solve what is often referred to as the economic problem, that is, the problem of terrible poverty alongside great wealth. As a group, they might be best described as practical philosophers. Some, such as Joseph Schumpeter, second from the right, were known primarily to other economists. Others, such as Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and John Maynard Keynes, were outspoken activists and reformers engaged in the political debates of their time. A major difference, of course, is that both Joseph Schumpeter and John Maynard Keynes were educated in the economics of their young adult years. They looked back to Smith and Marx for inspiration, but they attempted to describe the interplay of economic and social forces with the precision offered by mathematics. This would never have occurred to Smith, Marx, or the other political economists. A basic assertion of modern economics is that there is scarcity, that the finite resources available are insufficient to satisfy all human wants. Thus, economics sets out to study the processes by which scarce resources are allocated. The political economists, by contrast, examined the socio-political forces that govern the production and distribution of wealth, even though they were not always clear on what they considered to be wealth. Given the record of economists in recent decades, we might agree that economics is the science of explaining tomorrow why the predictions you made yesterday didn't come true. A shortcoming of modern economic analysis is the assertion that capital goods, buildings, machinery, and technologies are scarce, when in fact we seem capable of producing capital goods virtually without limit, so long as we have access to what nature provides as the source of capital goods. We humans are also very good at producing more of our species to provide whatever labor is needed. Moreover, we seem capable of constant improvements in productivity, meaning we get more and more out of less and less inputs of nature, labor, and capital goods. Technological improvements, slow in development for most of human history, now occur at a breathtaking pace. An important reason why the pace of technological change has so quickened is that basic knowledge is so widely shared. Scientific investigations are universal, and despite legal patent laws, much new knowledge is shared within the scientific community. Joseph Schumpeter coined the phrase creative destruction to describe how new ideas and new methods and new products emerge to replace those in existence. In his memoir, The Age of Turbulence, former chairman of the Federal Reserve Alan Greenspan reflected on all that was occurring in the decade of the 1990s. He wrote, "Business now had an enormous capacity to gather and disseminate information. This accelerated the creative destruction process as capital shifted from stagnant or mediocre companies and industries to those at the cutting edge." An excellent example of how this process has accelerated over time was provided by Jacob Bronowski in the television series and book The Ascent of Man, which appeared in 1973. Bronowski was born in Poland and studied mathematics at Cambridge University after his family moved to England in 1920. Later in life, he began his study of biology. In The Ascent of Man, he reminded us that the spread of scientific knowledge occurred both formally and informally. The publication of scientific work, he wrote, as the natural way to make it known to others, was an invention of the 17th century. It begins with correspondence, first between scientists, and then between scientists and a few men who became, as it were, clearinghouses for scientific information. Many of the same individuals who pursued an understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and other physical sciences were also engaged in exchanges of views on matters in the realms of moral philosophy and political economy. In the 17th century, the most influential philosopher in the English-speaking world was John Locke. More than any other person of the modern era, it was John Locke who built the bridges between natural science and political economy. Locke's primary intellectual focus was on epistemology, the study of the nature of knowledge. Many of his most important observations are found in his 1690 work, Essay Concerning Human Understanding. Alexander Fraser, in the introduction to a late 19th century edition of Locke's essay, wrote, "Few books in the literature of philosophy have so widely represented the spirit of the age and country in which they appeared, or have so influenced opinion afterwards." Locke challenged us to think for ourselves, to question tradition, conventional wisdom, and established authority. As he wrote, "When fashion hath once established that folly or craft began, custom makes it sacred, and it will be thought impudence or madness to contradict or question it. He that will impartially survey the nations of the world will find so much of their religions, governments, and manners brought in and continued amongst them by these means that he will have but little reverence for the practices which are in use and credit amongst men." Not unexpectedly, Locke's ideals found a receptive audience in British North America in the 1770s. Whenever the legislators endeavored to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience, and are left to the common refuge which God hath provided for all men against force and violence. And in search for truth, the key was to engage in inquiry without prejudice. Locke's contemporary, Pierre Bayle, produced the groundbreaking work, The Historical and Critical Dictionary. Of Bayle's contribution, George R. Havens, a professor of French studies at Ohio State University, wrote in 1965, "The author takes nothing on trust. He confronts authorities one with another, exposes their contradictions and discrepancies, estimates their relative value, and often suspends conclusions where a final judgment would be doubtful or theologically dangerous." Jacob Bernowski adds another profound observation. As Machiavelli had freed politics and Galileo physics, so Bayle freed history from the shackles of theology. Adam Smith then emerged as the chief voice for reform during the late 18th century, but reform within the confines of existing socio-political arrangements and institutions. Smith advised, "Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of things." Thus arose the phrase laissez-faire, that in our era has been interpreted to embrace the philosophy of self-governance. However, this interpretation is not what its French proponents struggled for in their own land. A more meaningful interpretation is a fair field with no favors. That is, a society with rules that prohibit privilege to some at the expense of others. These moral philosophers tried to reconcile principle with the state of societies in which they lived, recognizing that those in power permitted very little in the way of vocal opposition. This was particularly the case on what was referred to as the land question. That is, was private ownership of land and the private appropriation of the rental income derived from land a just arrangement? One of the earliest writers on political economy to face these issues head on was Richard Cantillon. Cantillon was born in Ireland but spent most of his life in France, where he was a very successful speculator. He is credited as being the first writer on political economy to define long-run equilibrium as the balance of flows of income, which later became a major part of the theoretical foundation of the French school of political economy known as physiocracy. Cantillon's main work, published posthumously in 1755, set the stage for a century and a half of debate over key moral issues underlying the study of political economy. Of critical importance, he defined land as follows: as the source or material from which wealth is extracted. Cantillon's definition of land or nature as the source of all wealth was brought back into the public dialogue by the self-taught political economist Henry George in the last quarter of the 19th century. Cantillon went on to define labor as the form that produces wealth. Thus, early on, here was one writer of note emphasizing that nature was the source of wealth, but appropriately excluded from the definition of wealth. To Cantillon, wealth must be produced by people, by labor. This position became the basis for the labor and capital goods theory of property. In France, a group of intellectuals led by the Minister of Finance, Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, physician to the king's mistress, Francois Quesnay, and patriarch of the family that established a great industrial empire in America, Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, developed philosophical principles similar to those of Cantillon that came to be known as physiocracy. Among their converts was none other than Benjamin Franklin. In 1768, Franklin wrote to Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, acknowledging receipt of the Frenchman's essay on physiocracy. There is such a freedom from local and national prejudices and partialities, so much goodness mixed with the wisdom and the principles of your new philosophy, that I wish I could have stayed in France to have studied in your school, that I might, by conversing with its founders, have made myself quite a master of that philosophy. Franklin wrote that upon arriving in France, his most anticipated meeting had been with Francois Quesnay. Physiocracy's most notable theorist, Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, addressed the troublesome history of how land was claimed and settled throughout France and almost everywhere else. The best lands at length came to be all occupied. There remained for the last comers only the sterile soils rejected by the first. But in the end, all land found its master, and those who could not have properties had at first no other resources than that of exchanging the labor of their arms for the superfluous portion of the crops of the cultivating proprietor. For almost all of its history, the Old World had come to be dominated by what the physiocrats referred to as the rentier class, those who lived off what others produced while producing nothing themselves. What also occurred is that even tenant farmers and sharecroppers were gradually removed from the land, displaced by cattle and sheep or resource extraction industries. The only option for these former peasant farmers was migration into the crowded cities of the Old World or to the European ruled colonial outposts scattered around the globe. We've reached the end of Lesson 1.